Let's say you've been assigned the task of writing a research paper where you are assessing the postmodern strategy of appropriation. Well, I've made this tutorial to help you out. Now, before you watch this video, make sure that you've read over the instructions for the paper very carefully. As you know from the instructions, you're going to be writing your paper on the work of art that you wrote your second discussion board post on. Now, as you know, in the sample post and response I provided to you in that discussion board, that my theme was colonialism and the work of art was Napoleon leading the army over the Alps by Kehinde Wiley. So for this paper, I'm going to be writing about that artwork, and then I'm going to bring in the second work of art, the one that he appropriated, which was Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon at St. Bernard Pass. Now before we get started, I just want to say stay tuned. At the end of this video, I'm going to give you some helpful information regarding how to research an art history paper, as well as review the research and citation requirements for this particular assignment. Now for your paper, you're only permitted to discuss 2 works of art. That's it, the 2 you were assigned. Now I'm going to be bringing in a couple extra for this video, just so I can further illustrate some of the points that I'm trying to make. But if I was writing my paper, I wouldn't do that. It would just be the 2 that I mentioned. Now you're going to be writing about either gender, race, or culture. Now I didn't want to weigh in on these themes in my discussion board assignment, since you're going to be doing that in your paper. So I chose another topic for myself, which is colonialism. Now your theme, gender, race, or culture, is something that you're probably going to want to discuss at least at some extent in your paper. You don't have to go into great depths, but you obviously are going to need to talk about it. If you want, it can be part of the context of each work, which you know that's part of the requirements to address context. Now I am addressing colonialism here because this may be a set of ideas that you might not be entirely familiar with. So I'm just going to explain this to you so you can understand what I'm talking about when I get to the analysis component of this video. Colonialism, put simply, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a fantastic website, by the way, put simply, colonialism is the practice of dominance. It's taking over another population and the land it inhabits, controlling it, exploiting it. This practice extends all the way back to ancient times, but we can think about it in its more modern iteration, which began around the 15th century. Think about people like Christopher Columbus. Maybe you heard of that guy. Now, my presentation is about Napoleon, who was a pretty notorious colonizer. And of course, he's motivated by his imperial agenda to spread the expanse of his empire far and wide, as it seems that he fashions himself as a continuation of a Roman emperor. And I'll talk more about that later. But there is also a wider cultural backdrop where it was believed that this was a moral obligation to go out and to take over, to tame, and I'm doing those like quote mark things with my hands because this language is so problematic, to tame and civilize these other cultures which were considered to be, quote marks, barbaric and savage, right? So let's talk briefly how that operates here with Delacroix's Women of Algiers. This piece is commenting on the role of women in Algerian society, and the French had colonized Algiers under Napoleon in 1830. It's a lot like, or maybe like similar to this idea that we were seeing with Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Remember this painting? It's a painting that, by the way, is made around the same time as Women of Algiers, so it's from the same style as well. So this idea of allegory, similar to this idea that the painting of the bodies of these women, in this case, are representing symbols of Algerian culture. Here the body represents liberty, here it represents Algerian culture itself. Now, if we set aside feminist arguments regarding how problematic this tendency of allegorical projection is, I need to stay focused here, we can already see the problems. First, the artist is depicting women from a harem, And we know all about this with Ong's large odalisque. Remember this piece? Also from the same lecture, Romanticism. So Delacroix is using this image of women in a harem, sexually available women lazing about, smoking their phallic symbol hookah, to represent a culture. Now, in typical Romantic style, the exoticism is really played up, really to the stuff of male European fantasy. You've got these women, and they conform to more European beauty norms rather than looking like the actual African or Muslim women that populated the area at this time. So you've got ethnic and racial identity essentially being erased as it's translated through a European perception. They sit in this richly carpeted and tiled room, very much typical of our, Middle Eastern, African interior decor, which would have appeared very exotic to the French at this time. So they sit in this exotic landscape, and it's very sensual with this diffused light source, sort of hazy from their hookah smoke. And you've got the woman in the foreground here that is lounging provocatively, making eye contact with the viewer. And it's not this sort of in-your-face provocation like Manet's Olympia, but it's more this sort of like sultry, come-hither look that we saw more so in Ong's large odalisque or Titian's Venus of Urbino. Now let's do a little formal analysis regarding implied lines. We've got some lines, right, that lead here, a line that leads here, lines that lead here, a line that leads here, a line that leads here. Oh, all these lines leading towards the crotch to reinforce this notion of sexual availability. Okay, so the representation of Algerian culture, highly exoticized and eroticized. That's a problem, right? The women here are available for the pleasure, the use, and the entertainment, the benefit of the viewer who is a French man. Now, take these ideas and apply them to the notion of colonialism, the practice of dominance, the overtaking of people and lands and exploiting them, and now you get the picture. What kind of cultural statement is being made in the context of the wider perceptions that Europeans had regarding foreign cultures at this time? Well, these clearly are not, quote mark, proper women. They are in a harem, right? Not at home taking care of families like good wives and mothers should be doing. They are smoking, which is definitely not an appropriate feminine behavior. And then look at their clothing, low cut and pants. Remember how the French artist Rosa Bonheur had to get a police permit to wear pants in public? These women are wearing pants. Scandalous, I know. By presenting these women, who again are a representation of Algiers as a whole, in this way it's reinforcing French notions of cultural superiority, that this type of immoral behavior can and should be remedied, that it's France's moral obligation to show them the way by imposing their cultural and their Christian ways of life. Now, let's keep this in mind, what I've talked about here. I'm going to address these ideas once again once I get into the artist that I'm writing my paper about, Kehinde Wiley. Now, you can structure your paper however you want, but I'm going to start mine out with an analysis of Napoleon at St. Bernard Pass, the work that Wiley appropriated. Now, you know from the assignment instructions that you only need to conduct a formal and iconographical analysis of the postmodern piece, but you may find it helpful to do the same for the appropriated piece. I almost kind of have to, because it's going to support a major point I'm going to try to reinforce over and over and over again in my paper, and that is the language of power. Now, this is something I'm relating to colonialism. The language of power is not necessarily something that you need to address in your paper, although you may find that it might be relevant to your set of ideas as well. Now, let's start with a little bit of context, because this is required for the paper. Napoleon is doing what imperialists do here. He's attempting to spread dominance eastward in Europe. He had to lead his troops and all of their heavy weaponry over the Alps, which those are pretty tall mountains, so this is not a small feat by any sense of the means. Now, any time is a great time for review, and we get to do that here. We saw this artwork in our neoclassicism lecture. Do you remember all the things that David did to make Napoleon look powerful in this image? Again, the visual language of power. Now, a lot of this has to do with the horse, right? This crazy horse, almost wild, rearing up, giant, powerful, muscular, majestic. And with all of this, effortless control, he's one-handed, no big deal, as they go up the side of a mountain. If this isn't epic, I don't know what is. Now, speaking of epic, he has this billowing cape that's activated by the wind to help create this sense of drama. It enlarges his physical presence, making for a hierarchical scale situation. As we well know, size equates to power. Together, the form of Napoleon and his horse create all these implied lines, diagonal ones that give a sense of tension and active movement as they charge up this mountain. Now, how about some iconography? Fancy uniform indicates the high-ranking military status of Napoleon, and it also implies wealth. The pointing of the hand, this is a gesture, a well-known one in the history of art, that is indicating that he is speaking, or he's commanding, which again denotes that sense of action. The horse also functions iconographically, indicates Napoleon's control not only over men, but over nature itself. And that's a pretty bold claim, but he's making it. You want to know what else is a bold claim? This treatment of light, sort of spotlight shining down. It's like this claim that God himself is taking time out of his busy God schedule to come and personally oversee and bless this endeavor. Again, suggested through the light. All of these things, compositional, iconographical, they effectively speak to power. And by the way, in reality, when this event happened, Napoleon was actually riding a mule. So we definitely have some propaganda going on here, as we would expect from an image that is conveying political power. Now let's move on to Wiley's appropriation of David's painting. So with appropriation, one of the key aspects of this strategy is to make it very clear that this is a modification of a pre-existing artwork, and Wiley has made that quite clear. Now look at the language of power. It is exactly the same. Much of the formal and iconographical analysis that I provided in the previous slide can be applied to this image here. The rearing horse, the commanding gesture, the riding up a side of a mountain, diagonal lines to create movement. I could talk about the colors, the predominantly warm color scheme here. It's bold and assertive to underscore this notion of power that Wiley presents to us. So this fulfills my formal and my iconographical analysis requirements. When it comes down to it, the only significant difference is the background and the figure who has replaced Napoleon, an everyday black man who's dressed in camo. This is not simply just urban fashion here, but it's reinforcing that military undertone that we saw in the original painting. Now, in the paper topic, you're asked to interpret what it is that your artist is saying about race or gender or culture. So what is my artist saying about colonialism? I will say this really quick. There is a lot that I can and should say about black masculinity, but I do need to stay on my topic, and I more so will be focused on colonialism. Because remember, anything that you write about in your paper needs to be connected to the paper topic. If not, it's off topic and you lose points. Now, this is going to be hard because we're working with really complicated, really serious issues here. But we don't have the time, we don't have the word count to address everything in depth. All we can do is the best we can, which is simply to make some points regarding a matter that is very, very complex. So I cannot talk about everything here. I'm just going to talk about some of the things. So colonialism lasted till around the mid-1900s, which really isn't that long ago, and its legacy lives on in what we call post-colonialism. How do expressions of dominance, mechanisms of control, perceptions of superiority continue to be addressed long after historical colonialism has ended? There are many examples to provide here, but again, we don't have tons of time, so I'm just going to give you some examples that are specific to an American context. So, historical example beyond slavery would be the segregation of schools and public places. There were once zoning ordinances that prevented minorities from purchasing homes in certain neighborhoods. There was a poll tax on voting that made it financially challenging for poor people, who often are minorities, to vote. Now, post-colonialism still exists in our culture today, and I have some current examples. Limited polling places in areas that are populated by minorities. So again, making it hard for them to vote. Laws that impose harsher penalties on crimes that tend to be committed by those of lower socioeconomic status, making for a disproportionate amount of minorities incarcerated in our prisons, drawing school district boundaries so that they contain minority populations and then fund those, or I should say underfund those accordingly. Even the exclusion or the mischaracterization of minority identity and experience in art. It's a removal of voice and visibility, and that's a form of post-colonialism as well. And that is definitely something that Wiley is addressing. I'd like to start this part of my discussion by quoting Wiley directly. 2 quotes here, because he says it better than I ever could. One, and again I quote, "Painting is about the world we live in. Black men live in this world. My choice is to include them." Quote number 2, "The conversation around power in painting is a central point of my work." So he's doing 2 things here. First, he's taking control of the cultural narrative. I would argue a big part of power is visibility, the ability to be heard and seen. And the language of power helps to ensure this. Black men do live in this world, and he presents them in a way that they should be seen, that actually all people should be seen, in ways which are positive and empowering. This man has a sense of agency. He is important, and he is an active and valuable participant. The second thing that Wiley is doing is he is taking that language of power and he's deconstructing it. He's interrogating it. He's critiquing it. He takes an image of one of the most powerful men in history and replaces him with a black man, someone who, in American culture, is typically not powerful. This man is presented exactly the same as Napoleon. So why is Napoleon's image of power unquestionable, but Wiley's image provokes a reaction? Is it the color of the man's skin? Is it the clothing that he's wearing? By making this switch, Wiley is encouraging us to challenge our own assumption and biases, our stereotypes regarding what it means to be black in America. And this takes us to the next question. Why use appropriation to convey this message? He makes his painting similar to David's, even using a similar title so that the connection is made clear, because he is calling attention to the source of the image. He wants us to be aware of it. He needs us to be, so that we are aware of an art historical tradition. There is something in art history called the Canon. It refers to an exclusive set of artworks that are generally agreed upon, quote marks again there, generally agreed upon as the best examples of art history in terms of technique and historical social significance. Now, this has been a problem in our discipline because who gets to decide what's best? It's led to a very strong Eurocentric and masculine bias that we art historians are still working hard to remedy, both in our own scholarship as well as the ways in which we teach our beloved discipline. So he takes this image of a black man, and through appropriation, he asserts him into history and art history. And then this work will hang in a museum. It does hang in a museum. An elite space reserved for representations of significant history and tradition, where so often, if the rare African or African American image is depicted, it's often not very positive. It's this whole Titian Manet appropriation situation. It's one thing to work within tradition, to honor it, to reinforce it. It's entirely another thing to open and unapologetically challenge it. And that's what Wiley is doing here. Remember, people like things familiar. They like the status quo because they know what to expect. And to suggest the status quo needs to be changed makes people uncomfortable because people don't like change. We don't know what to expect, and that can be scary. So by appropriating David's piece, Wiley is rejecting the stereotypes that inform the sort of thinking that perpetuates the status quo. He is rewriting the language regarding power. Who has it? Who gets to yield it? And how it is expressed. Now I just want to show you a couple more things to reinforce my points regarding Wiley's work in the language of power. First, you can see again that it is a long part of tradition, right? It goes back farther, even than Jacques-Louis David. This right here, the bossest emperor of all of the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius, right? Showing the power of Marcus Aurelius by showing him on the horse, the equestrian portrait. Napoleon knew full well about this pre-existing tradition, and he picks up on it to again link him as the next Roman Empire, the next Marcus Aurelius, which, by the way, nobody is the next Marcus Aurelius. I'm just saying that right now. So you see the tradition that Wiley is working with and critiquing. I'm showing you this piece so that you can see that appropriation actually is a strong part of Wiley's work. This is another example where again he's working with the notion of the equestrian portrait, and I'm bringing this in to show you how pervasive this tradition really is. And the same thing's happening here, this critique on the language of power, where here Wiley replaces King Philip II with Michael Jackson. Now, I include myself here standing there to give you a sense of scale so that you can see the size. And this is typical. Wiley's works tend to be rather large. And again, this makes sense because size conveys power. And I would argue that Michael Jackson was a powerful man. We give celebrities a lot of power in our culture. Sometimes we even elect them to important political positions. And I'm not just talking about reality TV star Donald Trump here. We had Ronald Reagan for president, and he was an actor. And I'm from California, where we had Arnold Schwarzenegger as a governor. Or you have WWF wrestler Jesse the Body Ventura, who was the governor of Minnesota. Now this leads me to my next point. Every morning, my ritual is this. I sit down and I read the news while I eat my breakfast. I always open up my news app on the edge of my seat because I'm looking for two things. One, will today be the day that they've opened up Qin Shi Huangdi's tomb, the first emperor of China? Or two, will today be the day that we have confirmed that we have indeed discovered Nefertiti's tomb, only the most powerful queen in all of Egypt's history? I will tell you, today was not the day for either of those things, but maybe tomorrow. But there was a faithful morning back in 2018 when I opened up my news app and came across the new portrait of President Barack Obama. And this was a big deal. This was a moment, a morning of all mornings, because I knew that I was looking at art history in the making. Now, you may have heard me say this before. Art history is the discipline of retrospect. We really can't know what will be significant, what will make it into the history books and lectures until time has passed and we've had the time to see how it all plays out. But not in this case. I knew immediately that this will be a work that will be part of art history. Why, might you ask? Because here, Kehinde Wiley has completely transformed the tradition of presidential portraiture. Consider that Obama is our first black president, first of all. Now that alone is going to make this painting stand out. Now take a look at this painting, right? Let's consider both of these. The painting itself, the fact that Obama was our first Black president, within a spatial context, where this portrait hangs, which is the National Portrait Gallery. First, take a look around. We see a bunch of white men. Second, we see that these are very austere, very formal images. We know from our studies of art history that presenting powerful men in this way, austere and formal, is highly traditional. We even saw some of this with the Napoleon portrait. Even the Marcus Aurelius equestrian portrait had a level of formality. So you could see how this would be a marked departure. Again, take a look around. But there's more to it than this, of course. Think about what we've been discussing about in this online tutorial, the language of power. It's very different here. It's not quite as obvious. And that's what I like about this. He's totally powerful once you look at the image, but it's a subtle power. It's almost like, to me, the most powerful kind of power. Because you've got people who bloviate and just talk about how powerful they are. And it's almost like they're too insistent, that they're maybe like overcompensating for something they don't actually have. It's like, if I can go back, Marcus Aurelius, the bossest emperor in the history of Rome, this has been interpreted as a gesture of mercy. He is so powerful that he can show himself being merciful, and that does not undermine his authority over Rome. What a total boss. So it's a subtle kind of power, the most powerful power there really is, in my assessment of power. Let's analyze this image. What would it be then that would make Obama look so powerful? This is a great opportunity for maybe you to test out your analytical skills. Maybe pause the video and try to work this out for yourself. Jot a few things down and then come back and see if what you found aligns with what I found. So first, let's talk about the fact he's sitting. Now this is where a lot of that subtlety comes in, because sitting is traditionally a passive and therefore a, quote marks, weaker position. But the sitting, first of all, makes Obama accessible. He appears to be leaning forward as if he's listening to us, actively interacting with us. Because he's seated, he doesn't tower over us, the viewer, so he's not intimidating us. He meets us eye to eye, and I'm saying that literally and figuratively here. Yet, with this eye contact, we see that this person is open, direct, and assertive. Great qualities for a leader to have. But he's not completely open. There's a separation between him and us because he is more powerful. So he can't exactly be on our level. There's a separation. And I interpret that separation through the crossed arms, the body language that closes him off. And this does seem to reflect some of Obama's personality. I recall during his presidency that a common critique was that he was too closed off, that he was too emotionally aloof. Which and this is just my personal thought coming in, I didn't think that that was a bad thing, because I think it's important for leaders to lead with this kind of objective, even keel, and to not be making these sort of reactive, emotive decisions. So, anyhow, cross the arms. And when his arms are crossed in this way, it's no coincidence that the wedding ring is now factoring in prominently within the composition. This was something that also was reflective of Obama as a person, that his marriage was very central and important part of his life, both personally and within his presidency. Okay, what else creates power or conveys it? So he's also manspreading, right? Opening up his legs, and this allows him to take up space to increase his physical size. And remember, size is tied to power. And you know that I always go there with the phallic symbols. Now, I'm not seeing a phallic symbol per se in this work, but I do see the legs open this way, as well as the suit right here. creating these implied lines that lead us to the crotch area. And remember that references to the phallic are also tied to power, because power is traditionally considered as masculine, because we equate things like aggression, bravery, strength with stereotypical notions of masculinity. To take a little trip down memory lane, we saw this exact same thing in one of the first lectures you watched in this class with Elaine de Kooning's portrait of another president, John F. Kennedy. Now let's take a look at the suit I just mentioned. First of all, it's a suit. It's an iconographical symbol. Conveys power because what type of people wear suits? People in high-powered jobs. Also, suits aren't cheap, and they need to be tailored, and that's definitely not cheap. So what other type of person wears a suit? That would be a wealthy one, and we know full well that wealth equates to power, which has been a thing ever since we began to see socioeconomic stratification all the way back in prehistoric times. But notice that with the tie, or with the suit, there is no tie. It's like a casual Friday situation, which is another reference to Obama being accessible. Now, what else indicates his wealth? How about the amazing chair he sits on? Or the fancy watch, which we can see because he is crossing his arms. And just a little more iconography, because you know I'm into it. He sits in front of a backdrop, this amazing pattern, right? And this is typical of Kehinde Wiley's work. This is a great way to tell a Wiley piece, is if there's all this amazing pattern in the background. He sits in front of this backdrop of amazing foliage pattern, and this heavily patterned background is very identifiable, not only to Wiley's work, but again meant to be speaking symbolically to Obama's identity. You have chrysanthemums, and these are the flower of Chicago, which was where Obama got his start in politics. Then you have jasmine, which is here. This is the flower of Chicago, or excuse me, the flower of Hawaii, which was where Obama was born. And then you have the African blue lilies down here, which speaks to his African heritage, Kenyan heritage more specifically. So, for this research paper, you are required to consult and cite within your paper 3 text-based sources. Books is what that means. Now, I know this is the 21st century, and there is such a thing as electronic resources, so you're definitely allowed to use those towards your requirement as well. Things like ebooks or online journal articles. What I do not count as a text-based source are websites, database entries, online encyclopedias, text encyclopedias, because I think that encyclopedias treat topics a little too generally, and your textbook. So you can see here in my bibliography that I consulted the required text sources. I also went above that, and I did also consult some websites, but again, that's above and beyond my 3 text sources. You'll see here that I am citing my sources in accurate Chicago format, although you are permitted to use MLA. The point is that it needs to be accurate. Every period, every comma, the title needs to be italicized, indentation, everything. And look over this thoroughly. I proofread this like 3 times before I put this up, and look what happened. I forgot a period right here. I'm getting a point deduction for that. So be very thorough, because this is definitely part of the grading. Not because I'm a mean, fire-breathing evil dragon, but because, you know, I'm a fluffy cloud. It's because it's part of the learning outcomes of this course. Now, I also include this biography here to give you a sense of what type of sources might be appropriate. I cited a thesis, my own, because I did use this knowledge and that research to formulate some of what I discussed here. I looked at a website article, didn't count as text source. Here, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which, by the way, again, amazing website. Here's a book. Here is a journal article. And here's another journal article. And that also gives you a sense of appropriate formatting as well. Now let me give you some hints. When you are doing your research, start out broad and work your way in. So I wouldn't go in necessarily and type in the title of Kehinde Wiley's piece, right? I might maybe start by putting in Kehinde Wiley, and maybe that would bring something up. I could also maybe go even broader and put in contemporary art, and maybe that would bring some books up, and then I could go in and see if Wiley's mentioned in that. Or maybe there's a book on African American artists, and I would look that up, and maybe he would be in there as well. Now let's say I found this like really general book, African American artists, and he's in there, and it's like this really great source. What I could then do is I can go to the back of the book, I can look in the bibliography, I could see what sources that author cited, and maybe those sources would be in the Yavapai College Library. Now, one thing that's really amazing about our library is we have this really robust interlibrary loan system. Our library is connected to 40 other libraries in our county. And what will happen is, if you see this great source, let's say I found this amazing source on Kehinde Wiley, but it's at the Verdi Library. I'm not driving out to the Verdi to go get a book, but I should still use it. It would help me. So what I can do is I can ask for that book to be sent from the Verdi to our campus, and then I can pick it up there, and they do it for free. Now this takes time, so you want to be sure to, not wait till the last minute. Right? That's always a helpful thing to not do. So that's one thing that you can keep in mind, is you can get books sent over from other libraries. Another thing that you can do is you can not restrict yourself to art history sources. This is going to open up a lot of possibilities for you. In fact, I'll just say this with my own research, I rarely actually consult sources that are expressly art historical. You know how to do the analysis. You know how to do the iconography. You definitely want to be not making up your own symbolism and, referencing the online symbolism dictionary. You know how to do formal analysis. But what you might not be as familiar with is the context, and that's where you might want to do research. So, for example, I could, and I did, you'll see I looked at a source on colonialism. So maybe you want to find a source that just talks about in general race or culture or gender, depending on which artist that you were assigned. So that's something to think about, is some of the more, or even like a source on just like contemporary art in general. How does your artwork sort of fit in with the contemporary approach overall? That's something to keep in mind. A book on the artist. Now I'm bringing that up, but be careful. Do not just include biography for no reason, or I'm going to mark you down as filler. It doesn't matter like what year this person was born and in what city and this person's favorite food or anything like that. Only bring in biography if it's relevant to the topic. You'll notice I didn't bring in any biography on Wiley, right? It wasn't exactly relevant at that point. I also recommend, and I think this would make it easier for you to write your paper, is if you can, to try to find primary sources, books or articles that were written by your artist. Or if you can't find that, books or articles that directly quote your artist. They can say it better than you can, right? And I did that. I brought in some quotes from Wiley. And that will help you with your interpretation, because you'll kind of know where you're going with that. You also want to make sure that you research both works of art, not just the one that you were assigned, your postmodern or contemporary piece, but you also want to be researching the original piece as well, which is why I included in here this book that I consulted on Napoleon. So hopefully this helps you, approach your research topic. I hope this tutorial helps to provide ample examples of how to go about conducting this particular form of analysis. If you have any questions, you know that I am always here to help you. Please do not hesitate to reach out. And with that, I wish you good luck.